Welcome to Sacred Stream Radio with Isa Gucciardi. Today, Isa discusses Huna, the ancient tradition of Hawaii.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about Huna, and I think that one of the most important things to remember is that Huna was a very active part of the Hawaiian tradition from the time that the Hawaiians arrived in the Hawaiian Islands, which is thought to be around 800 AD, up until the 1800s, when the Christian missionaries made it illegal for the Hawaiians to practice Huna. And it's a philosophical and spiritual belief system that is older than Hawaii. The Huna tradition is actually a window into this much more ancient tradition that can be traced linguistically across the Pacific and can also be traced in a very interesting way through oral tradition, which I'd like to describe to you. First of all, I'd like to say that Huna is an expression that has been translated in various ways. It is an expression that was coined by a researcher named Max Freedom Long, who was one of the first and more well-known Western researchers into the spiritual practices of the Hawaiian people. He came to Hawaii in the early 1910s, and in his research of the traditions that were being held there in Hawaii still very much undercover, he was picking up the thread of the ancient tradition of these spiritual practices after they had been pummeled by years of superstition, degeneration, and attack, both from within the Hawaiian culture and from the Christian missionaries. The word Huna that he coined means secret. That's the most commonly translated form of the word. And he certainly was trying to track this secret after all these years of when the secret had actually not been allowed to be practiced. It was, I remember as a kid, even growing up in the 50s and 60s in Hawaii, that we were not allowed to speak Hawaiian. It wasn't until the mid-70s that, or the late 70s, where even the speaking of Hawaiian was allowed in the schools. And this was 50 years after Max Freedom Long had been doing his research. And so he was definitely operating under the same kinds of constraints. And one of the problems that he had in trying to study the Huna tradition was that many of the Hawaiians were afraid to speak with him about spiritual matters because they were afraid of prosecution. So even though Max Freedom Long is one of the primary researchers in the external historic record, he was really operating under some severe constraints. And for other people who have tried to learn more about the Huna tradition, they have to generally go through a particular set of initiations, and at that point many times they won't be able to or desiring to talk about the Huna tradition. So it is, however, very accessible. The wisdom tradition there is accessible in the land and in the places where the practices were preserved. And that's one of the reasons why we go to Hawaii to study the tradition, is because it is still available there. There's a very interesting story that Max Freedom Long recounts, which provides a very important window into the connections that Huna has with this deeper tradition that precedes its preservation in the Hawaiian Islands. And it was in the 1920s that Long received a report from someone named Professor Stewart, who was a researcher into North African cultures, after he published a report on Huna practices in a magazine called the Psychical Review. This was a periodical which was read by occult enthusiasts of that time. And in it, Stewart outlined some striking similarities in the oral traditions of the Berbers to the oral traditions of the Hawaiians. Now, the Berbers are a group of people who live in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco in northern Africa. And the Berbers are distinct linguistically and also genetically from the other peoples in Morocco, and in the mountains. They live quite an isolated life, or especially in the 20s of the 1900s. They were living a very isolated life. It's less isolated now, but I was there in the 1970s, and even in the 1970s, it was difficult to get a bus into the Atlas Mountains, and could definitely feel yourself entering into a different time and place, and with great effort. So I'm sure that the Berbers have more exposure these days, but they definitely have been an isolated group in northern Africa for quite some time. And Stuart was an anthropologist, and he had gone to the Atlas Mountains to study the Berber people because they were of anthropological interest, being so isolated. So he pointed to some striking similarities in the historic oral traditions of the two people, because in the Psychical Review, Max Freedom Long had published an article outlining the oral tradition among the Hawaiians that described how they came to the islands of Hawaii. And I'm going to recount parts of their oral history to you, and then recount parts of the oral history that Stuart reported, so that you can see how similar they are in nature. So the Hawaiians describe having been in a green and lush land before desert came. And the Berbers describe the same thing, that their ancient ancestors had lived in a land of green, lush beauty, and there had been a process of desertification that had set in. Both traditions refer to the origination of this time as lost to history. And in both groups, they speak of their people departing from the place that had been green and luxurious by way of, quite literally, the Red Sea of Kane. They both refer to the same body of water as the Red Sea of Kane. In both cases, the departure was precipitated by reports from divination by the shamans and the priests of their culture that an intellectual and spiritual darkness was to descend upon the world in the coming years. And both groups report that a decision was made that 12 groups of people would depart that land and set off to faraway places to try and preserve the secret practices during this time of coming darkness. And some set off to other parts of Africa, others set off toward India, others set forth northward into Europe, and the Berbers set off to the Atlas Mountains. In the Hawaiian oral tradition, it is noted that one of the seers saw empty islands and a vast sea, and this is where that particular group headed, and they set off across the sea to find these empty islands. So it's very interesting to note that these oral traditions are so identical and in such different parts of the world. I mean, Morocco couldn't be too much further away from the Hawaiian Islands than it is. And there's even more evidence of some kind of common root between these two traditions, including some very interesting linguistic similarities in the references to the spiritual practices. And one thing to be noted also, that in his report, Stuart described the language that was used in spiritual practices among the Berbers as being different from the everyday parlance of the group. And so this is a separate language that is held only for spiritual traditions. And in it, the similarity of words in this language to the Hawaiian words for the same concepts is striking. For instance, the word kahuna in Hawaiian refers to a male priest or shaman. And in the language of the secret of the Berbers, the word kwahuna refers to males who hold the secret knowledge. In Hawaiian, the word kahuna wahine refers to a woman who is a holder of the secret. And in the language of the secret in the Berber tradition, the word kwahine refers to females who hold secret knowledge. Then also there's an interesting parallel in terms of the two words akua and atua. Akua in Hawaiian refers to the great universal principle or Godhead, and atua in the Berber language refers to the great universal principle or Godhead. Then there's two words that are similar to each other. One is prana and mana, referring to the same principle. Mana refers to power, and prana refers to life energy. Mana is held in the Hawaiian language, and prana is held in the language of the Berbers, which, by the way, is the same word that's used in Sanskrit to describe life force. So, very interesting to note this. And I think it's important to take these similarities in just to get a sense of the ancientness of the Hawaiian tradition.
Thanks for listening to Sacred Stream Radio, brought to you by Red Cow Records and the Foundation of the Sacred Stream. For more information, please visit us on the web at sacredstream.org.